Aloha and welcome. Welcome to the East West Center's Research Speaker Series. I'm Carlos Juarez and delighted to welcome you to our talk today. This is part of a recurring program to help spotlight emerging developments across the region. Through this series, we explore the environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. And today we're delighted to be joined by a longstanding friend and colleague here from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It's none other than Professor Eric Harwit. He's going to share a talk with us today on China's semiconductor industrial policy, an opportunity for us to look at different perspectives, particularly coming from, let's say, the West. Let me just share briefly, Professor Harwit. He's, of course, a professor here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where his work is focused on the politics of industrial policy development in China. He's the author of China's Telecommunications Revolution, a book he published through Oxford University Press some time ago that examines telecommunications and internet development in the PRC. The book assesses the political and social impact of China's data network, as well as the spread of mobile and fixed line telecommunications to both urban and rural parts of the country. More recently, he co-edited China's Globalizing Internet, History, Power, and Governance, published by Routledge. And here at the University of Hawaii, he teaches courses on comparative Asian development, China's economic advance, and the spread of communication technologies in the East Asian region. So join me in welcoming Professor Harwit. Thank you for sharing some look at China's industrial policy.
Good. Thank you, Carlos. I appreciate also the East West Center taking time to arrange my talk today. So I'll focus on, as the title indicates, industrial policy in the semiconductor sector in China. So as the slides say, I look at both the way the Chinese government is formulating their industrial policy for semiconductors to develop their domestic industry, and also especially to wean themselves from dependence on foreign semiconductor technology. I also consider what the Americans and other countries are doing to with their interactions with China and their own efforts to compete with China's rapidly growing semiconductor sector. I look at what effects current American policies are having, especially their export controls on China's semiconductor sector, and also what other countries are doing to enhance their own competitive edge against China. Okay, so first I look at what exactly is the Chinese industrial policy. So what is the Chinese government, what have they been doing for the last decade or so in order to foster their sector, which has become in many ways a world leader for semiconductor production, maybe not the most cutting edge ones, but some of the main semiconductors used in appliances, cars, and other areas around the technology sector. China has invested about $100 billion over the last decade, partly as this slide shows in their what they call the Big Fund. So direct state support to China's semiconductor supply chain, so not just the final product, but all along the supply chain. In 2024, in May, their third installment of $48 billion came into this large fund. But the main contributors then are these parts of the government sector. Slides. I'm sorry. Yes, so the largest investor is the Ministry of Finance with about 17% of the contribution, but the state-owned banks, so much of China's banking sector is a state-owned sector, includes some of the largest banks, ICBC, China Construction Bank, and also local governments. So it's not just the central government that's taking part in this. Local governments in big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and other cities are also key players. So we saw that, as I said, already for more than 10 years, the Chinese government has developed this large fund for investment. In the first round, they raised about $19 billion from central government banks and companies. The second round in 2019 added another $28 billion. And so this support, it's not just a straight cash, but also government grants, tax breaks, equity investments, and also low interest loans. So basically the kind of tools that a government industrial policy would utilize in order to focus on a key technology area. So what have the results been? Well, as I said a little bit before, in legacy chips, so these are, the kind of chips not that you'd have in your supercomputers or used for artificial intelligence, but for things that we really need in our daily lives, automobiles, consumer products like refrigerators, even your toaster will have a smart chip in it. And so these are chips in the technical terms of a 28 nanometers or larger generation. So we'll see that the more advanced chips for AI are maybe 2 nanometers. Even some of the Taiwan companies are working on even smaller process chips than that. But China has really become dominant in these larger chip production. So that by 2024, as the slide says, it had more production capacity than the rest of the world combined. So there's really major dependence then on these larger, not so sophisticated chips, but still very important ones for manufacturing. U.S. export controls, in fact, incentivize chip foundries in China to adopt domestic alternatives to foreign purchases. So in some ways, you might say that our restrictions on Chinese chips have actually backfired, that incentivize the Chinese to move forward with their own production capabilities. We do see some failures, though. So industrial policy isn't always sort of a magic weapon. Sometimes the money is wasted. So the Chinese themselves admitted in 2022 that $2.3 billion in semiconductors were basically wasted. They went to projects that never produced a single chip. Even the Chinese government admits that. So, for example, over the 3 years from 2019 to 2022, 6 new major chip building projects, including a couple I list here, Wuhan Hongxin Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation and Trenxian Integrated Circuit Manufacturing in Jinan, had failed. And so we see that the government doesn't always pick the winners as well as you might expect. But there are some very successful Chinese companies. And so in particular, in the next few slides, I highlight one of the major winners in this field, which is Huawei Technologies, or usually we just call it Huawei. So Huawei has since, even with these government restrictions, US government restrictions on Huawei sales of their technology and smartphones in the United States and other countries, they've been quite profitable over the last few years. And so we see that, as the slide says, in 2023, their profit doubled from 2022. It reported profit of about $12 billion on revenue of almost $100 billion. And we see that China has actually weaned itself from much of those markets that have sanctioned its products. Most of the revenue, 67%, comes within China, at least in 2023, the latest statistics that I had. 21% comes from Europe. So even some European countries outside of maybe Germany or France, but countries like Spain or Southern Europe, they welcome Huawei products. The Middle East and Africa take part of that as well. And only 6% came from the Asia Pacific and just 5% from the Americas, which includes South America, Latin America as well. In September 2023, Huawei introduced one of its most advanced smartphones, the Mate 60, which had 5G-like capabilities. So really one of the most advanced kind of smartphones on the global market with homegrown chips. So that's kind of the key thing. That even surprised American tech analysts that these chips were so powerful in those smartphones. In 2023, their smartphone sales in China rose 64%, at the same time that Apple's iPhone, which had been quite popular in China, their sales fell by 24%. So we're seeing Huawei rising, Apple losing market share. In 2023, Huawei spent about $23 billion on research and development, right? So that's a pretty big chunk of revenue for American companies. Typically don't spend that bigger percentage of their revenue on R&D. And so that was 23% of their $100 billion or so of revenue. As of early 2024, Chinese cloud companies sourced about 80% of their high-end AI chips made with as small as 2.2 and 4 nanometer process, though, from the American company NVIDIA. So as I said, The Chinese are still very dominant in those more legacy type chips with a larger nanometer process, but they still depend on NVIDIA and foreign companies for these high-end chips. So as I said, 2 to 4 nanometer are what you need for artificial intelligence. But one prediction is that that would fall to about 50 to 60% in the next 5 years. So the Chinese, even in these very cutting-edge chips, are catching up. We see, for example, Huawei, so again, Huawei, their Ascend 920B chip was seen as the closest to NVIDIA's export control bar chip of the A100. So we have these export controls on NVIDIA. NVIDIA does, as we'll see in a little bit, ship chips to China, but the US government puts restrictions on how advanced they can be for the China market. Let's see. In August 2024, Huawei was testing its Ascend 910C chip, which Huawei said was comparable to NVIDIA's H100 chip. So one of the most advanced of NVIDIA's chips at the time. From 2022, and NVIDIA, though, was prohibited, as I said before, we have these prohibitions on NVIDIA exports, was prohibited from offering its most advanced chips to China. And NVIDIA could only sell its downgraded AI H20 chip. So up until very recently, the H20 has been this kind of controversial chip. So I'll get back to the H20 a little bit more when I focus on NVIDIA a little bit later in the talk. NVIDIA may have been able to sell its H20 chip, but the Huawei 910C chip might have had better performance anyway. So again, the Chinese are getting pretty close to some of NVIDIA's pretty good chips, not the best, but some of their best. We see that Huawei may have sold, again, of these 910B chips, about 500,000 in 2024. NVIDIA was still the leader here, selling the export allowed, although sometimes barred chip, of about 1 million H20 chips in China. In April of last year, the Trump administration put export controls on the H20 chip, but then lifted them in July 2025. So as we'll see also, the Trump administration goes back and forth. Should we allow these good chips to go to China? Should we not? And so as we'll see at the end, there's still some kind of debate within the Trump administration about what China can get from NVIDIA and other American companies. Huawei, just still on Huawei, planned to produce 1.3 million to 1.4 million of the 910C chips in 2025, unless there were further US restrictions. So we see that Huawei production is really getting up to the same kind of scale as what they're importing from China, from the United States. There's some controversy, though, on Huawei's technology, right? So where are they getting it from? Are they stealing it? Is there's some sort of illegal activity here? In November 2024, one core circuitry produced by the contract chip manufacturer, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC. I'll talk about TSMC a little bit later. They're the ones that actually make the chip. So NVIDIA designs the chips. TSMC is the actual manufacturer within Taiwan or their satellite companies of the chips. So it was found in November of that year that there was some of their proprietary circuitry in the Huawei 910B chip, right? So maybe they're stealing some of these intellectual property. The circuitry, as I say here, should have been inaccessible to Huawei. And it could have been routed through a Chinese chip company named SOFCO, or called from maybe a Huawei chip stockpile that was amassed before the US sanction. But in any case, there was a controversy about whether Huawei was doing some shady things in order to incorporate NVIDIA or the TSMC technology into their production. Now I turn to Chinese policies to wean themselves from Western technology, and in particular from American technology, because the Trump first administration policies and then Biden administration as well, and now Trump too, all of them are having this idea that we have to protect our core technologies from China. And the Chinese response is, okay, let's wean ourselves. Let's take policies that try to eliminate as much as possible Western and particular American technology from our infrastructure. This policy has been deleted, called in one sense a delete A, or delete America. And this stems from a 2022 Chinese government directive. The state asset management company that manages state-owned enterprises in a document number 79, which initially targeted foreign software in IT systems, which should be replaced by 2027. So delete A over 5 years then in many different sectors trying to remove. So this one was focused on information technology, but semiconductor makers also started to adopt this policy of delete A for their foreign purchases. And the kind of slogan of the day was localized technology, or in Chinese, 新装, or IT innovation. In early 2024, the Ministry of Industry and Information Industry directed the largest telecom carriers to phase out foreign semiconductors by 2027. So I don't know if they're actually going to meet that goal, right? It's only about a year away, but still, already they were trying to achieve that dependence on domestic technology and not on foreign imports. The biggest foreign losers then, as you might expect, would be American chip makers, including Intel and Advanced Micron Devices, or AMD. And so NVIDIA would probably still be safe because NVIDIA makes the chips that the Chinese can't make. Intel and AMD are making more of the kind of legacy type chips that China can eliminate from their infrastructure. Domestic chip makers like Huawei then stepped into this void where they could make those kind of chips that the Chinese information technology companies needed, and in particular in the telecom market, right? So not sophisticated as artificial intelligence, but still very vital for directing information through the internet, through the wireless mobile system, all of those kind of equipment that you need for a well-functioning network. So Chinese providers are then moving from 5G, right, fifth generation mobile phones, which were introduced just a few years ago, now to 6G and maybe even more advanced kind of networks going forward. So we see, for example, that in October 2023, when China Telecom, one of the major mobile phone companies in China, bought 4,000 AI servers for their network, that 53% were powered by Intel central processing units, or CPUs, but the rest were by Huawei's Kunpeng processors. So you're seeing already getting almost pushing out then the American contribution to their telecom network, replacing them with Huawei equipment. In March of 2024, the Chinese government provided guidelines for government agencies and also state-owned enterprises from purchasing laptops and desktop computers with Intel and AMD chips, right? So again, and both of these companies, as I think one of the later slides shows, make pretty good profits and revenue from sales to China. So you see this delete A, right? The American companies are being pushed out and replaced with Chinese products. Of 8 options that were listed for purchasing central processing units, the top 6 were domestic CPUs, and the last 2 were still Intel and AMD. So the Chinese haven't completely weaned themselves. The delete A hasn't been achieved, but still there's that trend in that direction. And as I said, American companies like Intel and AMD derive a fair bit of their revenue from their sales to China. Intel's revenue from China declined from about $20 billion in 2019 to only about $15 billion 3 years later, right? So delete A seems to be working in that sense. AMD, China's revenue fell from about $5 billion in 2022 to $3.5 billion or so in 2023. China is Intel's largest market, actually, with 23% of the company's revenue in 2023. So this really does have a severe effect on Intel's bottom line. After AMD was restricted by the US from selling high-end AI chips to China, its revenue in the country fell from 22% in 2022 to only 15% in 2023. So our restrictions are not only encouraging the Chinese to develop their own technology, but even hurting our own companies from making profits outside of the US and in the PRC. Okay, now turning to NVIDIA, right? So maybe a kind of happier story than Intel and AMD. So kind of interesting, on January 20th, 2025, right, which was the inauguration day of President Trump's second term, President Trump was surrounded by executives, Tim Cook, other executives from the major tech companies. But where was NVIDIA's leader, Jensen Huang? He was in Beijing, right? So already there was that kind of message that NVIDIA really views China as one of their key markets that they don't want to lose, even with the new Trump administration coming in. So Jensen Huang is committed to the Chinese market, and the message here was NVIDIA would keep selling chips within US export control limits. So NVIDIA is very good at getting right up to that edge of the technology limits the US puts, but not going over them to violate the US restrictions. NVIDIA, so they say, which maybe is kind of rational, it's better to have its Chinese customers paying the company billions of dollars and staying hooked on its chips instead of finding a Chinese alternative, right? So that we can see Huawei has already substituted for Intel and AMD chips. NVIDIA says, well, we don't want them to do the same thing for our chips. And even Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and he's kind of an interesting figure in this whole debate about, do you sell the chips to China, do you not? He said in July of last year that you want to sell the Chinese enough that their developers get addicted to the American technology stack, right? So Lutnick's idea really is still sell them to China so that the American companies can profit, but again, that the Chinese don't continue with delete A for those kind of most advanced chips. China has historically contributed, in the case of NVIDIA, about 20% of NVIDIA's sales revenue, so a pretty big part of their market. In 2023, it sold about $1 billion of chips in China, ones that fell below these thresholds of the US government oversight, right? So they're being good to responsible company in that sense. But the share of NVIDIA's revenue gained from the China-Hong Kong region fell from 21% in October of 2023 to only 12% in October of the next year. It also fell in Taiwan from 24% to 17%. So even NVIDIA has been affected by these restrictions. We also see kind of an interesting element here that there are about 4,000 NVIDIA employees in China, right? So if you sell the chips to China, you need those people there to troubleshoot, to do sales, those kind of things. And we see that Huawei and other Chinese companies have actually tried to recruit those employees, right? So steal them into their own company, offering engineers and marketing executives double their salaries, right? Meeting at coffee shops and so on. But we see that NVIDIA employee turnover in China is actually pretty low, only about 0.9%, which is less than the company's global average of about 2%. So NVIDIA employees aren't so easily wooed by the Chinese offers of defection to the Chinese side. From 2022, NVIDIA sold its A800 chip just in China, an export compliant chip variant of their A100, which wasn't allowed. But then the H800 for China was an adaptation of the H100. So the H100, again, a more advanced chip. China's DeepSeek artificial intelligence company. So DeepSeek was in the news last year as sort of this upstart AI company that had capabilities similar to ChatGPT, but having achieved them with far less computer power and effort and expense than the American companies. So DeepSeek then used about 200 H800s to train its AI chatbot, and eventually had some 50,000 NVIDIA chips, including some H800s and H20s, and even some H100s. So I'm not quite sure how they got some of those chips, but so they were able then to use these allowed chips, most of them, in order to develop a pretty cutting edge AI technology. So there has been criticism, again, from the American government of NVIDIA, although again, back and forth. Even during the Biden administration, the former Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo initially criticized NVIDIA in December of 2023 for selling modified chips, but then she later said NVIDIA was a good citizen and that it was important to allow the company to compete globally. So again, what is the U.S. policy, right? Do we stop them, American companies, from selling chips and then incentivizing the Chinese to develop their own? Or do we allow them to go forward, keeping the Chinese hooked, as Secretary Lutnick says, and then also giving profits to the American companies? U.S. criticism of NVIDIA continued with the following license requirements for the A800 and H800. NVIDIA introduced this compliant H20, which I talked about. So it's a little bit of an alphabet soup here, these chips. But the H20 then has been in the news more in the recent year or two, which actually better in some ways than the previous H800. But in late January of last year, some members of Congress, so Congress people tend to be more critical of China for security reasons. They call for possibly banning the H20. So the administration, especially the Trump administration, has gone back and forth on this. Especially Republican members of Congress and some Democrats as well have said, no, these are putting a security risk for our selling these advanced chips to China. From last year, in mid-July, the Trump administration allowed the H20 exports to China. So the Trump administration kind of reversed course here, allowing the H20 chips. NVIDIA would avoid a loss of up to $5.5 billion in sales, right? So sort of lending a hand to Nokia, to NVIDIA. At the same time, AMD, right, one of the other major American companies, was cleared to resume sales to China of its advanced M1308 AI chip. So these developments come as part of a trade agreement, actually. If you remember, the U.S. had a trade agreement with China when they threatened to withhold rare earth or critical minerals from the United States. So this was part of the deal that we would allow these more advanced chips to go to China in return for China continuing with the rare earth, actually the rare earth magnets specifically was this a quid pro quo. And Howard Lutnick at the time, this Commerce Secretary, claimed the U.S. Was still not selling China our best stuff, as he called it, right? So again, sell them chips pretty close to the best, but not quite our best. And so keeping the Chinese, again, hooked on our technologies. And in late July, though, the Chinese Cyberspace Administration expressed to NVIDIA some suspicions of tracking and positioning functions in the H20 chip. So maybe NVIDIA is putting in spyware into these chips, right? So the Chinese government, maybe we shouldn't take these H20 chips after all, even though the US government allowed them. The Chinese government office stated recently NVIDIA's computing chips were revealed to have serious security issues. So now the Chinese are using this other kind of excuse, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't get the American chips because they're going to be a security threat to us. So the US say, well, we'll be a security threat to the American side if we sell the chips. The Chinese are saying it's a security threat to them if we buy those particular chips. And then finally, in December of last year, President Trump said NVIDIA could sell its even more advanced H200 chip to China with 20. So this kind of weird kind of Trump deal, I think it's a little bit strange, with 25% of apparently the revenue of these sales going to the US government, right? So the US government gets our cut of it, right? If NVIDIA is allowed to sell these most advanced chips. And AMD and Intel were offered similar terms, right? You can sell those chips to China, but the US Treasury gets our share of the profits. These H200 chips using 4 nanometer processes. So remember, 2 to 4 nanometer are what we're looking for artificial intelligence, are 6 times to 13 times more powerful than these H20 chips were allowed and are designed for artificial intelligence training. So really pretty important chips. They're 1.5 to 2 times more expensive than the H20, so more profits for NVIDIA. But they are 2 generations behind NVIDIA's most advanced chips, which are called the Rubin series. Rubin chips will be released in the 3rd quarter of this year with a 3 nanometer process, right? So the smaller the process, the more advanced the chips. which are manufactured by TSMC. So again, NVIDIA designs the chip, the Taiwan company actually makes them. And China gave preliminary approval then for 4 companies to import these most advanced H200 chips, ByteDance, Tencent, Alibaba, and DeepSeek, right? So these are all some of the major tech companies in China. Again, putting aside some of the suspicions that NVIDIA is putting in maybe some security leaks into those chips, at least initially. The US has also imposed what they call KYC, or Know Your Customer restrictions on NVIDIA to prevent military sources from acquiring the chips. So there's this sort of idea that, okay, we'll sell these advanced chips, but they better not go to the People's Liberation Army or other kind of security services. So, you can use it for commercial purposes, but we want to make sure that they don't get in the hands of Chinese elements that could threaten our national security. But on April 22nd, so yesterday, so I was working on this until yesterday, pretty much. As of yesterday, no H200 chips had been sent to China. And yesterday, again, Commerce Secretary Lutnick said that the Chinese central government has not let Chinese companies, as of yet, buy the chips because, and this is Lutnick's words, they're trying to keep their investment focused on their own domestic industry, right? So even though they can get access to these more advanced chips, the government is sort of keeping hands off to still incentivize, at least in Lutnick's thinking, Chinese domestic industry. The idea, though, is maybe President Trump is going to be in Beijing in a few weeks in the middle of May, and maybe the Chinese will announce, oh, yes, we bought a bunch of H200 chips just to kind of celebrate President Trump's arrival. So we'll see what happens. Well, President Trump likes to say that we'll see what happens when he makes his visit. This chart here, so I didn't make this up. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Actually, this shows the sort of relative capabilities of artificial intelligence compared to the US and China over the last few years. So you can see that as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, the Chinese were rather far behind capabilities of China in the AI, this kind of AI capability measurement. But they've been keeping up with the American level. And so they haven't passed us yet, but they're doing quite well in that sense. Okay, so this last part of the talk, then I'll look at competitors, in particular Japan and Germany, and then also the United States, and what are we doing with our industrial policy? What are those other countries doing as well to foster their semiconductor sectors? First turning to Japan, we see that, and so we usually think of Japan as quite an advanced technological company. In the late 1980s, in fact, Japan accounted for about half of the global semiconductor industry, right? So pretty dominant. We were afraid Japan was going to be the same kind of tech threat that we're thinking of China today. But by 2023, it was down to about 10%. Japan basically allowed much of the semiconductor sector to go to other countries and areas, especially Taiwan. So in fact, Taiwan then seems to be coming to the rescue of Japan. In 2021, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, announced it would spend $7 billion with help from the Japanese company of Sony to build a chip manufacturing factory in Kyushu. Sony already made chips nearby, so that kind of made sense. TSMC is also planning to build a second factory in Kyushu to begin operation next year. And the two factories together will require investment of $20 billion. It's pretty expensive to build these factories. Maybe $10 billion a factory is about what you need, and create 3,400 high-tech jobs, which is really important. You need these skilled engineers and technicians in the country, and Japan has those, right? So the US maybe doesn't have as many, as I'll discuss in a little bit. But so Japan is actually a pretty good place to try to ramp up quickly most advanced semiconductor production. Other companies taking part in this venture in Japan include Toyota, car parts maker Denso, and Sony have also invested alongside TSMC, with Japanese companies owning about a 13.5% stake. The first factory would make chips for cars, right? So that makes sense. As I said, you need chips for cars and also industrial consumer applications. And this would help the Japanese car industry as well. So it's kind of a win-win in that sense. The Japanese government, so again, we have industrial policy involved here, is providing about $1 billion in subsidies for flash memory chip plants, jointly controlled by the US company Western Digital and Japan's Kyoshia. And this comes as Japan's government passed an extra budget a couple of years ago and allocating more than $10 billion to support the semiconductor industry. So again, government involvement is key here. One of the most important projects in Japan is known as Rapidus, and that company plans to invest $35 billion by next year to build a factory in Hokkaido to make 2-nanometer chips, right? So the most advanced chips that you can use in AI, or at least up till now, the most advanced ones. And the US wants to see this kind of global diversification in chip manufacture. So the former US Commerce Secretary Raimondo indicated American support in particular for Rapidus. American companies are taking part in this as well. IBM is one of the key companies supplying 2-nanometer technology to Rapidus, but it's 2-nanometer maybe is too challenging for even for the Japanese. You really need, the sophisticated engineers and facilities and sort of technical knowledge in order to manage these factories efficiently. As of now, only TSMC and also South Korea Samsung have those kind of 2-nanometer production capabilities. Japan had fallen behind, as I said before, as Taiwan took the lead in building manufacturing building manufacturing specialized factories to produce these kind of chips, while companies like Apple and NVIDIA design the chips, right? So again, Apple and NVIDIA don't actually make the chips, they just do the design, and Taiwan makes them. Japan does still lead in some parts of the chip supply chain, though. So you need chemicals like photoresist to manufacture the chips. So Japan is still a key supplier of some of the elements within the supply chain of chip manufacturing. You need the photoresist. Basically, you put it on silicon discs, and then you have the kind of design with photolithography in order to actually manufacture the chips. I could go into some detail on that in the Q&A later if you have questions about that. So overall, Japan's semiconductor revenue goal is $100 billion by 2030. But the problem still is that most of the Japanese companies' customers don't demand the most advanced chips, right? Already they've got their customer base from Taiwan. And so overseas companies have these established partners. It's hard to see whether, even if Japan makes those chips, whether they can find the market for it. TSMC is also investing some $65 billion on 2 plants in the United States and another in Germany, and I'll turn to Germany in a bit. In the face of geopolitical risk of having production contained in Taiwan, right? So Taiwan, again, I can talk about that later, of course, faces this challenge from China, potentially an invasion. So if they diversify into overseas manufacturing, then that gives them that kind of security. The Arizona plants, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well, have been seeing construction delays as the company faced a challenge finding skilled workers. As I said, Japan has these kind of skilled workers. Taiwan's been developing them for many years. The US has a shortfall of those kind of engineers and that can actually manage these factories to the high degree of efficiency that you need. And so we did see, though, that one of the factories this year in Arizona did start making some 4-nanometer chips. So kind of getting there. But the first Japanese factory has been more on schedule, as Japan, as I said, has these skilled technicians required to run the factory efficiently. Now turning to Germany for just a very quick bit about what's happening there. In 2023, TSMC said it would invest $3.8 billion there to build the factory. The total investment in the plant would be more than $11 billion, right? So that's about what you need, including government support. So again, the German government is also supporting this with $6 billion. The EU had actually eased limits on government subsidies for semiconductor projects, so the German government would support the project. The TSMC factory in the city of Dresden is set up as a joint venture with TSMC holding 70%, the Germany's Bosch and Infineon, and the Netherlands and NXP with 10% each. And production is scheduled to start next year. It'll make advanced chips such as those for but mainly for cars. So again, not for AI so much. And the company began building the factory in 2024 in Dresden. But as in the US, the company faces a challenge of finding skilled workers. So similar to what the US is seeing in Arizona. The German government pledged in 2023 to pay $11 billion to support a $33 billion investment in a factory by Intel in the eastern Germany city of Magdeburg, and one of the biggest foreign investments ever actually in Germany. And the EU wants to double its share of the global semiconductor market and reduce its dependence on outside suppliers such as those from China. So the EU is also concerned about Chinese dominance, especially for their car industry. And then finally in Europe, we see the Dutch, Netherlands are really a pretty key player in this overall supply chain. So in order to make the chips, you need the designer, right? So NVIDIA, AMD, you need the manufacturer, TSMC, but you also need a company to make the machines that make the chips. And so here's where the Dutch come in. ASML is the major supplier of their very sophisticated extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that they don't sell to China. So that prevents the Chinese from very rapidly using those kind of machines to make the best chips. The company's chief executive, Christophe Fouquet, said in 2025 that China is far behind the West in manufacturing these cutting edge chips. So I think you should know because they make those machines that make those cutting edge chips. China is ASML's third largest market, so they do sell the less sophisticated chip making machines to them with about 20% of its current order backlog. And in January of last year, Chinese Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang met with the Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof, trying to get more advanced ASML equipment to relax those kind of export controls. But if they do that, it could exacerbate geopolitical tensions. Finally, then, in just the last few minutes before we take Q&A, what about the American industrial policy? So President Biden's CHIPS Act from 2022 of nearly $53 billion in that legislation. TSMC and also South Korea Samsung got more than $6 billion in incentive grants for their projects. As noted, TSMC was investing more than $65 billion to build these two factories in Arizona. So some of that came from the CHIPS Act, some of that came from their own funding. Samsung was investing about $45 billion in the factory in Texas. So we're getting those kind of foreign investments as well. The program's success came into doubt, though, because it was not clear if all of the promised chip factories would be fully built out. So one of the ones in Arizona was, the other one, we're not clear exactly when it's going to go online. TSMC and Samsung are expected to keep their most advanced chip production anyway in Taiwan and South Korea. So they'll make chips in the US, but not the cutting edge ones like they make in their home countries. TSMC's decision was based on the practical difficulties of moving most advanced chip making to the US rather than political considerations, well, and also their economic protection of their best stuff. CHIPS Act grants have focused on cutting edge chip factories that require tens of billions of dollars of capital outlay. But one projection is the US share in cutting edge chip manufacturing would eventually grow from zero, right? So we don't make those 2 to 4 nanometer, or at least the 2 nanometer chips, maybe to 28% in a few years. TSMC sought $15 billion from the Biden administration to build the two factories in Arizona. It was concerned, though, about US rules requiring the company to share profits and information about the operation. That was part of the CHIPS Act requirements. TSMC would give, though, more than $4.5 billion in cash as part of its overall $65 billion investment in Arizona. So others might be valued in technology or other kind of contributions, but a limited amount of actual cash investment. The US overall share just historically fell from about 37% 36 years ago in 1990 to only 12% in 2020. And so the CHIPS Act and foreign investment companies were meant to jumpstart that kind of production, with foreign company investments from TSMC seeing perhaps the US share rising to 20% by 2030, according to the US Commerce Department. Also, we see that Intel got $8.5 billion from the CHIPS Act in 2024, but that there really wasn't enough money in the CHIPS Act to go around. Companies wanted more than $70 billion, but the Act only allocated about $28 billion for the cutting edge manufacturing. In October of 2024, anticipating actually just a couple of days before the election, the House Representative, Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was asked about the CHIPS Act, and he said, well, we'll probably try to repeal it. But then later on, he said, well, no, it's not on the agenda. So he's going back and forth. Should we repeal the CHIPS Act? Maybe not. In January of 2025, President Trump said tariffs, right, his favorite word, not monetary grants would incentivize chip companies. And I have this quote here from Trump: they didn't need the money. They needed an incentive, and the incentive is going to be they don't want to pay these high tariffs. They're going to build the factory with their own money. We don't have to give them money. So again, sort of whatever Biden did was bad. Whatever he's going to do is useful. But again, Lutnick comes into the picture here. In January of last year, he said the CHIPS Act was an excellent down payment on an ability to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to America. But then, and it even reinforcing that in July of last year, the big beautiful bill under Trump actually increased the advanced manufacturing investment credit from 25% to 35%. So this is a tax credit that even the lobbying group, Semiconductor Industry Association, supported. In August of last year, Intel gave the US government 10% ownership of the company for $8.9 billion. So the US is even in that industrial policy actually owning a share of an American company. So overall, we don't know which direction the Trump administration will go to foster domestic chip manufacturing. And then just in the final, I think I've got one or two more slides here. Just a few months ago, the US government announced what they called a PAX Silica. And so in December, the US State Department coordinated the creation of this technology block to foster kind of a rival supply chain to that of China, going all the way from raw materials up to AI, including semiconductor manufacture. As of today, the bloc had 14 members, including the US, South Korea, Japan, and India, and also Taiwan is taking part in this kind of bloc. So it's, again, supposed to coordinate American allies to counter Chinese semiconductor manufacturing and technology, just in a broader sense. And in March last month, the State Department said it would have a $250 million to fund a $250 million fund to support this PAX Silica development. So finally, overall, I would argue that US companies like NVIDIA and AMD are still leaders in cutting-edge chip design, but if America and its allies don't move forward with investment in manufacturing outside of Taiwan, then those countries may fall behind China in control of semiconductor production, and given current trends, it's chip design perhaps as well. So I'll stop here and then take questions in the remaining time that we have.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for those very thoughtful. We will turn in. I just want to remind, in addition to our in-person audience, we actually have a large community online joining us, and they'll have some questions too. But let me begin by opening it to those here, and starting first, this gentleman in the corner. And if you have a chance, please introduce yourself and take one of these microphones up. Push the button, you'll see the red, and that'll allow you to speak. The mic is hot, and when it's over, you can turn it off.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I'm a PhD student too, and I'm an engineer myself. But I know that for the reason that TSMC can be successful in Taiwan because with a well-trained engineer, they're willing to work in manufacturing company, which is super high pressures and boring. But in the US, like the well-trained engineer, they kind of not willing to do the manufacturing job. So that I believe that's a big issue because and there's much more options in the US that you can work for, like Boeing's or software engineer. You can make a lot of money too. But in Taiwan, they don't have that much option to make a good money. So that's why good engineer, they're willing to work for TSMC. So my question is that how to solve this issue that allow that good engineer that willing to work for the like chips semiconductor company.
Good, thank you. That's a really great question. So I would say just kind of briefly that even a few years ago, the Apple CEO, Tim Cook, he was talking about sort of skilled machining engineers, so not necessarily semiconductor people. But he said in China, you could fill several football fields with those kind of engineers. In the US, maybe just a small conference room. So yeah, so just even the American companies have recognized that we just don't have those kind of engineers. Your question, how to remedy that? I mean, maybe give some incentives to universities to establish programs for those areas. Maybe incentivize the tech companies with maybe tax rebates or maybe subsidies in order to encourage training those kind of people with those kind of skills. I mean, it's hard, as you say. I think part of it, as you say, it's not a very easy job to do. And Taiwan has done quite a nice job of focusing in that particular area and becoming the leader really in those kind of manufacturing skills. But I mean, it's a long slog. I mean, to really train those kind of engineers in the United States, I think you have to maybe take those kind of steps, maybe focus on the education sector and the corporate sector with incentives to train those kind of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take just one that we have online, which is a very technical one, very interesting. It's a question that asks from an anonymous attendee, from a strategic standpoint, what matters more from a semiconductor manufacturing standpoint? Raw materials like cobalt coming mostly from the DRC in Africa, or refined metals like neodymium?
Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, you need all of those kind of elements for your semiconductor manufacturing. I mean, I haven't sort of gone down into the details of exactly which, you know, elements or rare earth in particular, you know, sort of scarce kind of elements that you need for the manufacturing. So I can't really give you sort of the exact percentages of those different elements. I mean, I would say that, you know, obviously Taiwan has access to the kind of materials that it needs to manufacture the chips. And I think it's, you know, you mentioned, I guess, say, cobalt comes predominantly from Africa, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? So where China actually has made a lot of investments in recent years to get some control over those kind of minerals. So you do want to make sure that you have those raw materials and that China isn't sort of dominating at that end of the supply chain, right? Because then they can even have more leverage over even manufacturing of the end product. But I think, you know, China also doesn't want to shoot themselves in the foot by rationing those kind of elements and then not being able to get the chips that they do get from you know, from Taiwan or, you know, through NVIDIA design chips. So I think there's some sort of balance there on those kind of elements versus the end product.
Thank you. Let's turn to Denny, please.
Thanks for your presentation, Aaron. So we have this debate in the United States that you refer to whether or not to sell China advanced chips, maybe not the most advanced, but close to the most advanced chips. And on one side of that argument is Jensen Huang and Howard Lutnick arguing that, as Lutnick put it, we want to keep China addicted to buying U.S. chips. However, the intention of the Chinese government is clearly not to remain addicted to American stuff, but to move toward eventual independence. So in that sense, they might be seeing this as a sort of a stopgap measure to buy these American chips, but it's not going to last. So doesn't that weaken the argument on for continuing to sell them this stuff rather than making them try harder, expend more energy, and maybe not succeed in making their own advanced chips?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I mean, I think in, you know, sort of in this sort of short-term kind of viewpoint, you say, okay, let American companies make profit, right? Even though it's kind of that stopgap mechanism for the Chinese to still develop their industry. But probably in the long run, I think what your question, I think, implies that the Chinese are going to catch up anyway, right? So we're just kind of helping them to sort of get by until they actually reach those kind of capabilities. So it could be maybe the smarter policy is to, I mean, you could figure, well, okay, they're going to catch up anyway, so why should we be filling in that gap until they reach that level? So yeah, I mean, I think you've described the overall trend here, but I think Lutnick is more kind of focused on the profits for companies like NVIDIA, at least in the short term, and then sacrificing the idea that we're sort of filling in China's gap until they can actually catch up. So maybe we'd be better off by just saying, okay, we're not going to give you very good stuff at all, and but I think eventually they're going to catch up anyway. So to me, it seems they're almost unstoppable. Whether it's going to be 5 years or 15 or 20 years, eventually they're going to catch up. Yeah, so I don't know if that's quite a clear answer there, but I think that's the overall trend in the sector.
Yes, Charles.
Just a couple of comments. One is that you described basically a kind of competitive race between China and the United States, and you have Germany, and you have the EU, and you have Japan. I presume Korea is somewhere in there. And to some extent, maybe this is quite functional, that we need competition to push things ahead, and that's what we're seeing. And so it's not bad. The other comment is that, we think of industrial policy as quite different, say, between the Western capitalist countries and the Asian, more market-oriented countries. But there are many elements that seem quite similar. A lot of investment by the government. Now, with Trump's tariffs and China's restrictions on foreign chips, trade controls, governments in the capitalist world taking shares of companies. So how would you describe the major difference between, say, China's industrial policy and American industrial policy based on this particular case study of chips?
Right. Yeah, an excellent point. I think typically we don't think of the Republicans as supporting this kind of industrial policy, right? It's more like the Democrats under Biden with his CHIPS Act, right? I mean, that's sort of more the typical industrial policy that Republicans criticize. But as you say, President Trump has moved more, and I think in some ways toward that kind of typical industrial policy, especially as you say, acquiring a stake, ownership stake in Intel, actually asking for a 25% cut of the revenue from NVIDIA sales, right? So again, this more deeper involvement actually of the U.S. government in the sector. So it seems like I think the Trump administration officials are recognizing that the U.S. government can play a role and maybe should play a role, even in contrast to what they said previously in criticizing the Democratic policies about industrial policy. So yeah, so kind of a surprising, I don't think we would have expected Republican administration, even under President Trump, taking these kind of steps in this sector. Yeah, thank you.
Let me take another one that we have from online, and I'll add to it. We have a question that says, how do U.S. export controls on semiconductor technologies affect countries like Malaysia and Vietnam and its relationship with both China and the U.S.? And to me, it just speaks to really this element of the geopolitics. Even though you're talking about China and the U.S., really there are other players. I'm also reminded that right now, as we speak, U.S., Mexico, and Canada are renegotiating this trilateral agreement. And part of the second version of the USMCA itself had a lot to do with limiting, imports coming through Mexico that might have been from China, and yet also a rise in maybe ones coming from other places. So getting around that. So just maybe anything you can shed a light on this question of how it impacts these other players, the relationships, like I mentioned, Vietnam, Malaysia, even Mexico.
Right. Yeah. Excellent question. Yeah. No, in fact, there's been some idea that some of the chips that more advanced chips we export to Southeast Asian countries or even say Singapore eventually get into China. And with, they shouldn't be going there, but they do. So some of the countries that you mentioned, especially maybe Vietnam, more closely allied with China, or even Malaysia, actually are not necessarily respecting the American guidelines on what is allowed to be transshipped into China. So yeah, when you have a global kind of trade environment like that, you can't always police every kind of element. Even I heard a story about Israel, which gets some of the most advanced chip manufacturing equipment from ASML or those kind of companies actually transshipping those machines even to China in violation of all kinds of rules and laws. But But yeah, you can't always prevent those kind of things from happening. So when you have a global environment like that, yeah, then I think that can be the case there as well.
Suppose that we're going to pre-closure again, a valuable chance to learn about this update and to understand the changing dynamics. In this case, China's industrial policy, but also how it's connected to so many other players. Thank you so much, Professor Harwit. And for those of you who joined us, we have many online. Thank you for attending as well. I also want to shout out and recognize, of course, these are possible to put together without our great staff. We've got Dana and Christina in the house. We've got Anna who's outside, and they've also helped kind of coordinate, bring us all together. And those online, let me just remind you as well, and those here, that there will be a YouTube recording posted on our YouTube channel, and that can be shared with others who are not able to make it, or another version of it, so go a little deeper. So thank you all again, and grateful for your coming to share some of your insights here. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah.